The following table lists the modifiable item categories.
A cost estimate identifies the resources required to produce a product or service. These costing items can use existing master data and prices from the SAP ERP application, such as activity prices from Cost Center Accounting or CCA and material prices from Materials Management or MM. Depending on the item category, the detail screen of a costing item contains the following data. Item category required for each line item. Resource, such as material number or cost center. Work center for activities processed internally. Plant, cost element, quantity, unit of measure, total price, fixed price, total value, fixed value, currency.
The following table lists the modifiable item categories.
When displaying a cost estimate, only the fields that are ready for input are displayed in the Details screen section. Note, for more information about unit costing, refer to the documentation in Product Cost Planning or PCP in the SAP library under the chapter Working with Reference and Simulation Costing. In addition to the modifiable costing item categories mentioned, there are special costing item categories as shown in the figure. A short description of these costing item categories is as follows. Overhead or G. Overhead costs are not directly related to the costs of production but have a sizable effect on the manufacturing costs. In order to allocate this cost, the costing sheet functionality is used. Process costs or X. You can use the costs for business processes in a cost estimate as either a replacement for or supplement to the traditional method of allocating overhead costs. The process costs are generally allocated using templates. Raw materials cost estimate or I. The raw material cost estimate enables you to include delivery costs, allocate overhead and include additive costs at the material component level even though there are no BOMs or routings for these. Data for cost calculation of these raw materials is taken from purchasing info records. Total items or S. Total items are used by the system to calculate totals for rows. You can define which rows will be totaled in a formula. By default, the total row will summarize the values of all rows above it. Operation items or category O. Operation items or category O transform the values of other rows of the cost estimate using simple formulas. For example, you can create a formula to summarize rows 1 to 10 of the cost estimate and add 10% to the result.
Each cost estimate that you create is based on a costing variant. A costing variant for material cost estimates contains control parameters to determine the quantity structure automatically and to update the prices in the material master. These settings contain information such as the prices used by the system to cost materials, activities, and business processes. The control parameters contained in the costing variant and the settings you define depend on whether you create a material cost estimate or a base object cost estimate.
Each costing variant contains a valuation variant and a costing type. The valuation variant determines at which price materials, activity types, processes, subcontracting, and external activities are valued by the system. For example, the latest price or the average price calculated for the entire fiscal year. The costing type determines the purpose of the costing, such as base object costing or material costing, and the price update permitted.
The parameters for overhead costing are summarized in a costing sheet. Overhead rates are used to pass on costs to cost centers that do not directly reference the production process. This way, you can, for example, distribute the costs from a warehouse cost center to production orders for which the material was taken from the relevant warehouse. More specifically, the costing sheet determines the following parameters. The direct costs to which the overhead is to be applied is calculation base. The conditions under which the overhead is to be calculated is dependency, whether the overhead is allocated on a percentage or a quantity basis. The percentage amount or the amount per unit is overhead rate. The period of validity for the overhead. Which object, namely cost center, process or order, is to be credited and by which cost element. The overhead key determines the overhead percentage rate which will burden the cost of the product. You use the overhead key to apply different rates to different groups of base planning objects or products. You define it in customizing and enter it in the costing sheet.